Good morning. Glory to Jesus Christ. Glory forever. I want to begin with a quote by St. John of Damascus. A very famous quote. It's probably one of his most famous quotes. The whole earth is a living icon of the face of God. So in today's presentation, we're going to look at the veneration of icons and iconoclasm, which was the attack on the veneration of icons. We're going to look at the life of St. John of Damascus, who's also referred to as St. John Damascene, and the contribution he made to the church with regards to the defense and veneration of icons. And then we're going to look at the saints and empresses who emerged as heroes and defenders of holy icons. But let's just take a couple of steps back and let's talk about, where did icons come from? Icons were the normative religious art form of the church, both in the East and the West, until the 13th century. And after that time, the West developed a more subjective way of expressing religious art. And so in the West, schools of art developed, and we can see distinct styles after that time. And so we can identify different styles of art. If we went to a museum, for example, we might say that's a Michelangelo, or that's a Caravaggio, or that's an El Greco, because there are distinct styles. But the East, however, has always maintained iconography as its primary religious art form and continues to paint icons according to the canons or the rules that have been handed down, which ensures a continuity of faith throughout the ages. It is believed that the first icon of the Mother of God was painted by St. Luke the Evangelist, and we just celebrated his feast day, I believe it was yesterday. Now let's look at what an icon is and what an icon is not. Number one, an icon is not simply an interesting or unusual work of art, although icons are interesting and they may seem unusual if we are not accustomed to seeing them, but that's not all they are. Number two, an icon is not simply a museum piece, although we do find them in museums, but they are not simply an antiquated art form relegated to a museum where we go to get a glimpse of the past. And number three, an icon is not simply a piece of decor that we hang on a wall because it adds to the aesthetic of a room. It matches our color scheme. It happens to be the right piece to hang on a right space on the wall or something. Even though it may be all those things, I have icons in my home that beautifully match the color scheme of my living room, for example, and they do fit on, they're just the right size in the right place on a wall, but that's not all they are. So what is an icon? And icons are windows into heaven. They are holy images that make present the person they depict. And so icons make the invisible visible. They are meant to be venerated in private prayer and public worship. They are painted by praying people for the distinct purpose of prayer. Icons inspire people to pray, and they can even bring people to repentance because they are painted through divine inspiration acting on the Spirit. And so we approach an icon in silence, with a pure conscience and an open heart. In other words, in a spirit of prayer. When we look at an icon of our Lord, his mother, the saints, it's not only that we look at them, but they look at us, and they invite us to contemplate the heavenly realm in which they dwell. The icon is not a portrait. A portrait depicts a person's earthly appearance, while the icon depicts his internal state as well, the inner condition of their soul. And the principal means for accomplishing this is in the face, the facial expression. The icon is not painted to depict everyday life, but the spiritual realm. And so icons change the perspective and the form of the image so that it is not naturalistic. And this is done so that we can look beyond the appearances of the world and instead look to the spiritual truth of the holy person or the event. And so icons reflect the unseen spiritual struggles of the person it's depicting, and they must radiate heavenly glory. Now, this is most poignantly illustrated in the icon of the crucifixion. Rather than depict the naturalistic death of Jesus on the cross, the icon of the crucifix depicts, it radiates heavenly glory. Now, let me explain. The Western style crucifix, which we see on the wall there, the intent of that depiction is to depict naturalism and realism, right? And so the sculptor, the artist, whatever it may be, will depict on a Western style crucifix. They might want to capture the suffering of Christ. It might have the crown of thorns. There might be a lot of blood. They're trying to capture in a naturalistic or realistic way the suffering of Christ, right? When you have an icon of the crucifix, now there are similarities, of course. Jesus is nailed to the cross. There's a cross and Jesus is nailed to it. So those are similarities. But with the iconographic depiction, the icon is trying to tell us something or teach us something theological. It's not meant, the intention is not to depict the naturalism or the realism which Christ suffered on the cross. It's to teach us something about the theology of the crucifixion that Christ suffered. And so we see in the icon of the crucifix, Jesus almost looks like he's floating in front of the cross. His body seems to be very serene. There's a gentleness, there's a curve to his body. It's a very different type of depiction. It strikes us differently. And it may strike us as odd at first until we understand the theology behind this. His head is slightly bowed towards his mother. And the reason why it depicts the gentleness and the serenity in the face of such a horrific death is because it's showing us, it's teaching us the theology that Christ willingly suffered on the cross. And so in the Byzantine divine liturgy, during the Eucharistic prayer, the priest will say, on the night he was betrayed, or rather, when he surrendered himself to death. By saying that word rather, a very important nuance and distinction is being made. It's one thing to be betrayed on the night he was betrayed. It's another thing to say he surrendered himself to death. And so this is what we see here, that even as he was suffering the horrific act of crucifixion and being nailed to the cross, he was in control of his will. That's why he is depicted with a gentleness and a serenity, because he says, I have the power to lay my life down and I have the power to lift it, to raise it up. No one can take that from me. I have the power to do that. He was in control of his will. That's what's depicted on the Byzantine crucifix. Okay, so icons are theology in line and color that tell us something, and that teaches us something about the faith. And so icons are visual sermons that express in images what the Gospels communicate with words. And so the language of icons, if we can use that terminology, is like the language of the Gospels. It's clear, it's direct, and it's uncluttered. There is nothing superfluous painted in an icon that could make it cluttered. And so if you're painting an icon of a biblical scene, for example, everything has a specific meaning or a symbolic meaning. And so the iconographer wouldn't say, well, you know what, this took place outside. I'm going to put some clouds in the sky. Let's put some birds up there. Let's put up some bushes. Let's put some rose bushes. Let's put some more flowers in the background. Nothing is superfluous in an icon. Everything that's painted in an icon has symbolism or meaning, and it's meant to be uncluttered and simple and direct, just like the gospel message. Now, whichever form the faith is handed on, whether it's handed on visually through iconography or it's handed on verbally through the spoken word, through the written word, through catechesis and so forth, it must adhere faithfully to what has been handed down. We do not reinvent the wheel when it comes to teaching the faith, and we do not reinvent the wheel when we paint icons that also teach the faith. And so the Second Council of Nicaea declared, we declare that we preserve intact all the written and unwritten traditions of the church. And that's why iconographers follow certain canons or rules when painting icons, because they are painting the faith that has been handed down to us. Now, that doesn't mean that iconographers are robotic when they paint, okay? As children, we may have all been familiar with paint by numbers, right? And it would be a big deal to get a paint by numbers kit for Christmas or your birthday. And if you'll recall, the board would have numbers, right? So number 1 might be red, number 2 is blue, and so forth. And so you would paint exactly according to the number in the paint by numbers. That's not quite the same with iconography. Iconographers can make adjustments based on their artistic skill, but ultimately the icon must correspond with the person or the spiritual or theological meaning of the event. Because icons are not painted according to the imagination of the artist, Christ, his mother, and the saints must look like the person depicted. However, the iconographer does have certain leeway in painting icons. And so that's why I lined up all these different icons of St. John of Damascus. And you can see in each one, there are variations in colors. His head wrap is a different color. It has different designs in the head wrap. The clothing may even be somewhat different. But as you look at these icons, you can see without a doubt, this is the same person. Even though the iconographer, and we assume these were 4 different iconographers at 4 different times of history, even though the iconographer used their artistic skill in making one head wrap might be kind of white with red detail, another one is blue, and so forth, we see that it is the same person. And how we can tell this is all the same person, St. John of Damascus, is because the face and the beard and the head wrap are all the same. He is always depicted with a head wrap, and you can see the face and the beard are the same. So we know this is St. John of Damascus. Now, if we look at an icon and we can't see, maybe we can't read the name of the saint on there. Let me back up. When an icon is painted, it's not finished until it's signed with the name of the person or the name of the saint. But if, when making copies, for example, we can't see exactly who it is, we can still tell by the face and the beard and the head wrap, this is St. John of Damascus. And so I would challenge you now, as you go forward, go do a Google search of just put in St. John of Damascus icons, and you will see he looks like this all the time. You'll see variations in colors and so forth, but you'll be able to say, that's St. John of Damascus. And we can do that with all of the saints, right? And if we don't see the name in there, we can still, like I said, we can still be able to tell who it is because of the depiction. It corresponds to the person. Okay. And if we're not sure who it is, we look for the name because the name will tell us. The names can be written in Greek, they're written in French, they're written in English, they're written in Romanian, they're written in all kinds of languages. Okay. So who or what can be depicted and venerated in icons? Our Lord, his mother, angels, saints, Old Testament figures, prophets, biblical scenes, and feast days. How do we venerate an icon? We bow before them, we kiss them, we pray before them. When we venerate an icon, we are not venerating the paint or the wood, we are venerating the holy person. And St. John of Damascus makes this very clear. Christians do not worship the material of the icon, but venerate the persons represented in the icon, whether it be Christ, the Virgin Mary, or the saints. And St. Basil the Great says, the honor paid to the image passes on to the prototype. And so when we venerate an icon, when we honor a saint in an icon or venerate them, that veneration passes on to the who that we are venerating. And so a very important distinction must be made between veneration and worship. Veneration is to show reverence or respect for a holy person in their image. Worship is meant for God alone. Now, in secular practice, we show honor and respect to things that represent leadership or authority. We salute the flag. We give a military salute. We curtsy to royalty. At one time, men would tip their hats as a sign of respect to a lady. I see a man here in the audience with a hat, and later on he'll tip his hat to show respect to all the ladies here. Okay, but these gestures, which are so common in secular society, are even more appropriate when we honor or respect holy persons or things. Let me give a little example of this. At my former parish up in Ohio, I was a member of the cathedral, the Byzantine Catholic Cathedral. And at that time, we had a bishop named Bishop Basil. And because it was the cathedral parish, we would often see the bishop because he would come and celebrate pontifical divine liturgies at the cathedral. And so on one particular day, he celebrated the liturgy, and all of the people went to the social hall afterward for refreshments. And we were all sitting in those big round tables, 8 or 10 people, having our refreshments, waiting for the bishop to come in because he was still finishing up in the sanctuary, in the sacristy after the liturgy. And when Bishop Basil walked in, the whole social hall stood spontaneously and gave a warm applause like this. Nobody said, please stand for the bishop. Nobody said, here's Bishop Basil, put your coffee down and greet him. Nobody elbowed anybody and said, there's the bishop. Nobody. The people stood, even the people that had their backs to him, instinctively knew when the bishop walked in, the whole social hall stood up and gave a warm applause, because the people had an innate sense that we honor holy persons. And we just saw him 10 minutes earlier. You know, we could have said, oh, there he is. He finally made it to the hall. But the people had an innate sense that we honor holy persons. Now, whether or not any particular bishop, priest, pope, leader, anybody, whether or not they're personally holy, the office is holy, and we honor the office. It's the same as the president. No matter who the president is, no matter what they're like personally, we honor and respect the office, right? So in our faith, we venerate the Mother of God, the saints, holy images, but also relics. Our faith believes that grace is present in their images and in their relics. Now listen to this quote of St. John of Damascus. The saints, during their earthly life, are filled with the grace of the Holy Spirit. After their departure, the same grace remains in their souls as in their bodies, their relics. And that same grace is present and active in their sacred images and icons. Now, in the case of the cross, if we took two pieces of wood and we put them together like this, we could venerate this cross because it symbolizes the cross of Christ. If we take those two pieces of wood apart, we would not venerate this piece of wood and this piece of wood because they don't mean anything. Put them together, it symbolizes the cross, and so we would venerate it. Now, if they were two pieces of the actual cross, or even just a sliver, then we would venerate it. If we had a piece of wood, let's say it was this big, and it was the true cross, we would venerate it because it's the true cross. And we know that there are slivers of the true cross, relics, all over the world today. Now, all of this may seem like we are preaching to the choir, because as Catholics, we routinely venerate holy images and relics, and we innately understand why we do this. However, this was a major issue that arose during the iconoclastic controversy. And sadly, the accusation of idolatry is still leveled at the church today by modern day iconoclasts who accuse us of, quote, worshiping, quote, statues or pictures or icons or so forth. Okay. Iconoclasm was a fierce battle waged in the church in the 8th and 9th centuries, in which icons and holy images were destroyed. And those who kept or venerated them were persecuted, and many were even murdered for their defense. It was promoted by the Byzantine state, led by Byzantine emperors, but some patriarchs and bishops agreed with the iconoclasts and enforced the campaign from within the church. The destruction of holy images was carried out by those within the church and without the church. And iconoclasm lasted about over a period of 100 years. There were two periods of very intense attack against those who were painting, keeping, or venerating holy images. The first period was 726 to 787. And the second period was 814 to 843. There are two words which are very important in understanding the iconoclastic period. The first word is iconoclast. Icon is the Greek word for image. So an iconoclast is a destroyer of images or a breaker of images. On the other side is an iconodule, D-U-L-E, which is a venerator of images, or an iconophile, P-H-I-L-E, which is a lover of images. So you had the iconoclasts and the iconodules. And these two terms have come to describe the two sides of the battle. Now, as with all heresies in the church, God raises up certain figures, saints, theologians, sympathetic rulers, emperors, empresses, to declare the true teaching of the faith and defeat her enemies. And so certain key figures emerge on the iconoclasm side, and certain key figures emerge on the defense of icon side. Chief among the antagonists on the iconoclasm side during the first period was Emperor Leo III. He's also known as Emperor Leo the Isaurian, and his name has become synonymous with iconoclasm. He has gone down in infamy as the chief architect in the destruction of holy images. Other emperors would continue his reign of terror. And so the first wave of persecution under Emperor Leo III was ushered in around 726. Why did Emperor Leo and the iconoclasts wish to destroy holy images? What was the gist of the attack that saw so many defenders of icons tortured, imprisoned, exiled, or even murdered? Primarily, we could say it was based on the heretical belief that icons were idols that needed to be destroyed. But there were various factors that influenced the mindset of Emperor Leo and the iconoclasts. And these influences ranged from military to political to ideological to theological. Now here's some context. After the Muslim conquest, the Byzantine Empire was in constant confrontation with Muslims, politically, militarily, and theologically. And Muslims believe that you cannot make visual representations of religious figures or even living things. And that's why we'll see in Islamic art, you see patterns, graphic designs and patterns, but not holy images or holy people or what they would consider holy according to their belief system. And they believed that the Christian veneration of holy images was idolatry. And Emperor Leo III himself may have had leanings towards Islam and may have adopted their ideological thought. In addition to that mindset, the emperor was losing military battles, which he believed was happening because his people were, quote, worshiping idols, unquote, as opposed to the Muslim victories of a people who did not paint holy images. And in other words, Emperor Leo thought, if we keep losing and they keep winning, it must be because we are doing something wrong that is causing God's wrath and displeasure to come upon us. And that so-called something wrong must be worshiping idols in these icons. He also believed that the veneration of icons was an obstacle to the conversion of Muslims. And so in Emperor Leo's mind, this whole idea of venerating icons was detrimental to the strength of the Byzantine Empire in many ways. Another influence that contributed to the iconoclastic mindset was the pagan belief of worshiping gods. The pagans believed that the gods inhabited and were worshipped in their images. In other words, a statue of the goddess Venus was Venus herself. But they confused veneration with worship and believed that venerating icons was the same as worshiping the person depicted in the icon, because that's how they understood the pagan worship of gods. And so they projected onto Christianity their belief. For Christians, this is far from the truth. Another influence that contributed to the iconoclastic mindset was the Jewish interpretation of the second commandment. You shall not make for yourself an idol or a likeness of anything in the heavens. You shall not bow down before them or serve them. Okay. However, elsewhere in the Old Testament, God commands the Israelites to craft images. So what was God telling the Israelites in those passages? God gave the Israelites the second commandment in order to keep them from falling into idolatry, because there are true images and there are false images. And graven images are false images created to worship false gods or idols. And so the injunction to craft images for the temple deals with the worship of the one true God, which is true worship. But the iconoclasts put icons in the same category as the graven images God was warning the Israelites about in the second commandment. Whatever Emperor Leo III's personal convictions were, which may have been a combination of all these things, his attack on Christian iconography was brutal, not only during his reign, but in the reign of subsequent emperors who continued his campaign of persecution and torture. So Emperor Leo III's destruction began with the icon of Christ over the entrance gate of the imperial palace in Constantinople. He destroyed that first. And then the iconoclasts moved on to churches, which were stripped of icons. The icons were burnt and destroyed. Basically, every sacred image that could be found was desecrated and destroyed. Icons, mosaics, frescoes, gospel book covers, sacred vessels, vestments, illuminated manuscripts, anything that had a holy image on it was destroyed. And those who painted or venerated icons were exiled, imprisoned, tortured. Some were even put to death, and monks especially suffered from their wrath, because the monastics were like the front line of defense of the veneration of holy icons. And so they got it, the wrath of the iconoclasts, they suffered it especially. But iconoclasm extended even beyond the hatred and destruction of holy images. It also involved the rejection of the veneration of the Mother of God, veneration of the saints and their relics. Now, we might ask, what does all of this have to do with the Latin Church of the West? Because this took place in that part of the Byzantine Empire in the East, and the West didn't seem to be particularly pulled into this controversy. There was a third wave of iconoclasm, and this one hit the West. This particular period of iconoclasm occurred in the Protestant Reformation. Iconoclasm reared its ugly head again under the Protestant pastor John Calvin. Throughout the 1500s, outbreaks of destruction and religious images occurred in Western Europe, particularly Germany, Switzerland, and the Netherlands, by Protestant mobs. They destroyed images in churches and public places. In Switzerland, another Reformation leader named Ulrich Zwingli took the iconoclast position so far that he ordered all churches to be stripped bare to the point of even removing the organs in the churches. In England and Scotland, there was government-sponsored removal of images. In France, there were several outbreaks of iconoclasm. Even today, it is typical to not see any religious imagery in some Protestant churches, except in some cases, maybe a plain cross. Now, John Calvin did not specifically engage the apologetic argument of St. John of Damascus and St. Theodore the Studite because he was probably unaware of them. He probably didn't even know them. He probably wasn't even aware of their theological writings on the subject. If he had been familiar with them and their writings, the Protestant ethos may look different today. Who knows? The attack on holy images, however, occurs even today. On a regular basis, we hear in the news, more often than we should, that someone took it upon himself or herself to desecrate a holy image or a statue in the most brutal way. More often than we should, we hear it. Turn on the news, somebody's destroying a statue, somebody's spray painting something, whatever. So iconoclasm still goes on today. Maybe those are carried out by pagans, atheists, who knows? Now, some would even argue that the Latin Church has suffered iconoclasm at its own hand, as churches have been stripped of holy images and statues in recent times. But just as the faith can never be snuffed out entirely, even when the church undergoes persecution, the yearning for beauty and transcendence in the human soul also cannot be snuffed out. Now, the attack on the veneration of holy icons was not simply a clash of wills. One side wants to venerate icons, the other side does not. Which side will prevail and have their way? Iconoclasm and why it is so important to our faith was ultimately a heresy, and it was a heretical attack on right belief. The heresy is the iconoclastic belief that icons are idols that are being worshipped. Where Jewish and Muslim belief leaves off, that to depict God in images is idolatry, Christian theology picks up. Now, like Jewish and Muslim artistry, Christian iconography also does not depict God the Father in images, not because we consider it idolatry, but because we cannot depict what is invisible. John's Gospel says, no one has ever seen God. And this brings us to two very important theological words with regards to the veneration of icons and the proper or the right or the orthodox right belief understanding. These two words are uncircumscribable and circumscribable. Now we'll recognize the word circumscribable because the prefix circum is like circumference, right? And so if something is circumscribable, scribe means to write or to draw. If something is circumscribable, it means I can draw it. And so if you're sitting in front of me, I can draw you. Because you have a shape, you have a form, you have a body. And so I can draw all around you, circumscribe. I can draw your head, your arms, your legs, circumscribable. Anything that's seen is circumscribable. If I see it, I can draw it because it has a form, it has a shape. Uncircumscribable is used to describe God the Father. He is invisible. He does not have a form. He does not have an image. So we cannot depict something that is invisible. And that is why God the Father is never depicted in iconography. And that is why in the icon of creation, Jesus is the one depicted doing the creating. We don't put an image of God the Father in the icon because he is invisible. He is uncircumscribable. But through him, Jesus, all things were made. All things came into being. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And that's why the one doing the creating in these icons of creation is Jesus. St. John of Damascus says, in former times, God, who is without form or body, could never be depicted. But now, when God is seen in the flesh, conversing with men, I make an image of the God whom I see. And in the letter to the Hebrews, it says, in times past, God spoke in partial and various ways to our ancestors through the prophets. In these last days, he spoke to us through a Son who is the very imprint of his being. Because God became man in the person of Jesus Christ, the invisible now becomes visible and can be depicted in images. And so the icon of the Son shows us God the Father. Jesus said, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. And so John of Damascus' emphasis is on the change that occurred between God and the visible world when he became man and assumed a material existence. Jesus became incarnate, God became incarnate in Jesus. He took on matter, he took on flesh. And because of that, he's circumscribable. We can draw him, we can paint him. And so the church's entire defense of painting and venerating icons rests on one word, the incarnation. Now, if anyone asks you where in the Bible does it mention icons, it is explicitly mentioned in Colossians, the first chapter. Christ is the icon of the invisible God. Icon is the Greek word for image. And most translations will say image. Christ is the image of the invisible God. Now, there have been saints and holy people from the beginning of salvation history who have destroyed pagan images and demonic idols. Even before the incarnation of Christ, images have been made that depict unholy things. And from the time of the Old Testament to the New Testament, and in the life of the church ever since, holy people were known to destroy pagan idols, which are demonic in nature, in defense of the one true God. The first scriptural precedent for the destruction of idols is in 2 Kings. King Hezekiah removed the high places, he shattered the pillars, he cut down the wooden images, and removed the places where idols were being worshipped. He also broke into pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made because the Israelites were burning incense to it and they made an idol out of it. In the New Testament, in the book of Acts, St. Paul performed many miracles, and his miracles caused pagan sorcerers to convert to Christ, and they immediately burned their spell books. In the accounts of St. John the Evangelist, he was exiled to the island of Patmos because his prayers were causing pagan idols to fall. There is a tradition that during the Holy Family's flight into Egypt, statues to the native gods crumbled and fell at the Lord's presence, which led to the conversion of some of the people. In the 4th century, the Empress St. Helena, upon arriving in the Holy Land, ordered the temple to Venus, which was built over the site of Christ's crucifixion, to be demolished, and had built over it the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. St. Nicholas is known for his destruction of the Temple of Diana and other pagan shrines in his city of Myra. Much of the demolition was carried out by his own hand, though he also had to struggle in prayer to overcome the demons that inhabited the temples. In the West, St. Boniface went to Germany, and he chopped down with his own hands an oak tree dedicated to the god Thor. He used the timber to build a chapel on the site. St. Victor of Marseille was ordered by the emperor to stand before a statue of Jupiter and offer incense to the god. He refused. He kicked the statue, which fell and shattered and was crushed under a millstone. So we can see throughout salvation history a great cloud of witnesses defending the right and proper worship of God and the right and proper veneration of icons, even to the point of suffering and dying. So let's just look at the life of St. John of Damascus before we take a break. He suffered for the veneration of holy images, and he gave us one of the greatest theological writings on the subject. St. John of Damascus is referred to as the seal of the fathers. He was the last of the Greek fathers of the church. He is also known as the golden speaker or the golden stream. He was highly intelligent. He excelled in many, many areas of study. But he's best known for his writings on theology and his defense of the faith. He is credited with the first written refutation of Islam, and this is why he is considered the first apologist of the Christian faith to the Muslims. One of his most famous writings and of interest to us today is his work called On the Divine Images. So he was born around 675 in Damascus, Syria, to pious parents. His pious family lived under a Muslim caliphate, Muslim rule. His father was a Christian, the whole family were Christians, and he was highly respected by the Muslim authorities. And he was appointed as the magistrate of the city, and because of this, the Christians under Muslim rule fared very well. John of Damascus' father died, and he was appointed the chief counselor of the city, but his deepest desire was to become a monk. And it was during John's lifetime that iconoclasm rose up in the Byzantine Empire, especially around Constantinople. However, because John of Damascus was living in Damascus, he was out of reach of Emperor Leo III's vitriol. But news of iconoclasm reached John in Damascus. And although he did not travel the world speaking in defense of holy icons, his writings were read all over the Greek Empire, and he had a great influence on the orthodoxy of faith in the church. In other words, he was the right person at the right time, chosen by God, equipped with the grace of the Holy Spirit to elucidate the teaching of the faith, and his written defense of icons then reached as far as Constantinople, which enraged Emperor Leo III, the iconoclast. But since John was living in Damascus, the emperor could not put him in prison or execute him like he had so many others. So the emperor devised a wicked plot to harm John and to try to stop him from defending the veneration of icons. And so the emperor forged a letter pretending to be John, and stating that he was offering whatever help the emperor needed to conquer the Muslim caliphate in Damascus. And since John's writings were so widely distributed, it was easy for the emperor to get a copy of his handwriting and his signature. So the emperor sent this forged letter to the Muslim caliphate, the ruler, that basically said, I'm John, and I'm giving my help to the emperor over here to destroy your rule here in Damascus. The Muslim caliph believed the letter was written by John, and he immediately ordered that John's right hand be cut off and hung in the marketplace, and that he be led through the city of Damascus in chains, and all of those things occurred. John's right hand was cut off and hung in the marketplace. So St. John of Damascus requested of the Muslim ruler to let him have his hand back, and the Muslim ruler agreed and let him have his severed hand. John spent the evening in prayer before the icon of the Mother of God, the one who shows the way. And he fell asleep before her icon. And then he heard her voice telling him that he had been healed. And she commanded him to work unceasingly with his restored hand. And then upon awakening, St. John of Damascus found that his hand was reattached to his arm, and only a small red mark around his wrist remained as a sign of the miracle. And so he had a silver figurine of his hand made, and he placed it in thanksgiving in front of the icon of the Mother of God. And tradition believes this is the first votive offering made in thanksgiving of a favor granted. And we're all familiar with votive offerings. We see it all the time. We do it all the time. We light a candle, we bring flowers or some other token of thanksgiving to the Mother of God or a saint for favors granted. And so this is how this icon became known as the Virgin of Three Hands. Now, a misrepresentation has occurred in iconography where some iconographers misunderstood or misinterpreted this story, and they painted the Mother of God with three hands. She doesn't have three hands. She has two hands. The third hand is the silver figurine that St. John of Damascus placed at her icon as a votive offering. When the Muslim caliph learned about this miracle, he became convicted of John's innocence. He asked John for forgiveness, and he wished to restore him to his former office, but John refused. John of Damascus gave away all his riches to the poor. He went to Jerusalem. He entered the monastery of St. Saba, and he lived the life of a holy monk. Now, just as we close before the break, there's a story that illustrates John's holiness as a monk. He was living with an elder monk in the elder monk's cell in the monastery. And one day the elder monk heard John singing one of the hymns that he had composed. And the elder monk was disturbed that John had forgotten his vows so quickly and was making merry by singing these hymns instead of weeping for his sins. And so, calling John to obedience, the elder monk imposed a harsh penance on him. And he said, if John wishes to be forgiven for his transgression, let him in humility wash out all the chamber pots in the monastery and clean every one of the latrines. John rejoiced exceedingly and was eager to undertake the shameful task for the sake of showing his obedience. And he began the work with diligence, touching excrement and soiling the right hand that the Mother of God had healed after it was cut off. The elder monk, after seeing John's obedience and his humility, embraced him and restored fellowship with him. And so, in addition to being a great theologian, he was a true and holy monk. John of Damascus died a peaceful death somewhere around the year 750, more or less, making him close to 100 years of age. In iconography, St. John of Damascus is always depicted wearing a head wrap, and it is said that the head wrap is actually the bandage that he wore around his severed hand. About 40 years after St. John of Damascus' death, the first wave of iconoclasm was defeated through the action of the female Byzantine Empress Irene. Irene was the wife of the Emperor Leo IV, who was an iconoclast. And Empress Irene had beauty and intelligence, and she was also an iconodule, a venerator of images. And although her husband was an iconoclast, she kept icons hidden in the palace, which was very dangerous. Her husband died suddenly, and the son, who was heir to the throne, was too young to reign, and so she became the regent for the son, which was a great thing for the defense of holy icons. But Empress Irene's legacy was convening the council that would defeat iconoclasm. And this council was convened in Nicaea on September 24th, 787, and this is known as the Seventh Ecumenical Council. And that's what is depicted in this icon. It was attended by 308 bishops, and the Council Fathers addressed the accusation of idolatry based on the second commandment, that you shall not have any graven images and so forth. But at that council, those Council Fathers referred to several Old Testament passages which proved the lawfulness of holy images used in worship. And among those two passages that they mentioned was how the Israelites were to craft the Ark of the Covenant and the temple. And you can read all about those, the instructions that God gave, and it goes on and on and on. It's very detailed in the book of Exodus, chapter 25, and in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 41. So the Holy Fathers of the Council issued a declaration of faith that holy images are to be accorded the veneration of honor. And although Pope Adrian was not present at the council, a letter written by him was read aloud in which he approved the veneration of images. And so the council proclaimed this teaching: venerating icons, having them in churches and homes, is what the church teaches. They are open books to remind us of God. Those who lack the time or learning to study theology need only to enter a church to see the mysteries of the Christian religion unfolded before them. Icons are necessary and essential because they protect the full and proper doctrine of the Incarnation. While God cannot be presented in his eternal nature, no one has ever seen God, he can be depicted simply because he became man and took flesh. And in taking a material body, God proved that matter can be redeemed. He deified matter, making it spirit-bearing. And so if flesh can be a medium for the spirit, so can wood or paint be a medium for the image, although in a different fashion. Veneration is not idolatrous, since it treats the image as a door or a window through which the person praying to the image perceives and adores the heavenly personage depicted in it. And so the triumph of the iconodules was not only that they could now venerate icons, but it was the triumph of orthodoxy or right belief over the heresy of iconoclasm. It was the triumph of right belief in the incarnation. The Seventh Ecumenical Council declared this: as the sacred and life-giving cross is everywhere set up as a symbol, so also should the images of Jesus Christ, the Virgin Mary, the holy angels, as well as those saints and other pious and holy men be embodied in the manufacture of sacred vessels, tapestries, vestments, and exhibited on the walls of the churches, in homes, in all conspicuous places, by the roadside, and everywhere to be revered by all who might see them. And so the lawful veneration of the saints, holy images of all different kinds, relics, was declared. The Seventh Ecumenical Council also decreed that every altar should contain a relic. The decisions of this council were greatly influenced by the theology of St. John of Damascus and his writings in defense of holy images. The Empress Irene was later exiled and spent the remainder of her life committed to asceticism and prayer. And she is depicted in this first icon. I may have mistakenly identified this as the icon of the Seventh Ecumenical Council. I believe this is the icon that of Empress Theodora and the final declaration of the veneration of icons at the next council. So let me just stand corrected in that, make that note. Okay, so now we come to the decision of the council, Seventh Ecumenical Council in 787, the decisions were made for the lawful veneration of images once again. And so after 787, the church enjoyed a period of calm until a second wave of persecution occurred. And once again, a female empress, Theodora, played a central role in defeating iconoclasm once and for all. She saw the restoration of icons as her first and most pressing task. Like Empress Irene before her, she took over the rule of the empire after her husband died and their son was too young to reign. Like Empress Irene before her, she too was a woman of great beauty and intelligence. She was pious and devoted to the faith, and she also was a venerator of holy icons. Like Empress Irene before her, Theodora's husband was also an iconoclast, causing her to secretly venerate icons in a very tense and somewhat dangerous situation. But Theodora carried out her duty with gentleness and patience around her husband in order to mitigate his cruelty. But all around Theodora at that time, confessors of the faith were being tortured and exiled by the iconoclasts, but she remained steadfast in the true faith. And she kept secret icons secretly hidden in her chambers in the imperial palace. Eventually, her husband was struck down with a serious illness, and he was racked with pain and delirious, and she brought out a hidden icon of the Mother of God and placed it on his face. Tradition says that he kissed the icon and confessed the true faith before he died. That's one tradition. So then Theodora took over the rule of the empire after he died, because their son, who was heir to the throne, was too young to reign. And so she convened the Council of Constantinople in 843, which defeated iconoclasm and restored the veneration of icons once and for all. In addition to convening the council, Theodora recalled the confessors of the faith from exile. And then she had the tomb of the iconoclast emperor Constantine V desecrated and his remains removed from his tomb in the Church of the Holy Apostles and burned, with the ashes scattered so that no site would ever be associated with his burial. And she replaced his tomb with the body of Empress Irene, whom she admired and whose footsteps she followed in stamping out iconoclasm. The Empress Theodora devoted the last years of her life to prayer and fasting. Now let's look at a few of the saints that God raised up under the reign of the Empress Theodora, who also suffered for the defense of icons. The first is Saint Theodore the Studite, whose icon is here. He and Saint John of Damascus are like bookends of orthodoxy in the theological writings on icons. He is called the Studite because he was a monk, an abbot of the Studian monastery in Constantinople. The Studite monks are still in existence today. I know that they're in Ukraine. I'm not sure where else in the world they are, but they continue as a monastic order. During the time of St. Theodore the Studite, the monastery was almost extinct. It got down to only 12 monks, but after he brought spiritual renewal to the monastery, it was revived, attracting around 1,000 monks who desired to have him as their spiritual father. And so the Studian monastery became one of the shining lights of Byzantine monasticism. But more importantly to our discussion today, he became one of the greatest heroes during the second wave of iconoclasm. St. John of Damascus, the first wave, and now St. Theodore the Studite, the second wave. He not only suffered in defense of icons, but St. Theodore the Studite was exiled 3 times, and the last time he was beaten and bound and led from one dark dungeon to another for 7 years. He was finally recalled from exile and died in the presence of his brother monks, chanting Psalm 118. He was known to work miracles during his life, which continued after his death. And like St. John of Damascus before him, he too wrote an apologetic treatise entitled On Holy Icons. And so these 2 books are the go-to texts to read to gain a good understanding of the right belief of the veneration of icons. St. Theodore the Studite on the holy icons, St. John of Damascus on the divine images. By reading these 2 books, you will have a very good grounding and a very good theological sense of what the controversy and the veneration of icons was all about. So another saint that I want to highlight who lived during the time of the Empress Theodora was Saint Lazarus the painter. He's also referred to as Saint Lazarus the iconographer. He was a priest. He was the first iconographer canonized in the church. He refused to destroy any of the images he had painted, and so he was imprisoned. And then he was brought before the emperor under penalty of death. And then he was tortured by having red-hot horseshoes applied to his hands, burning the flesh to the bone and almost bringing him to death. But he was miraculously healed. And he was rescued from further tortures and death by the Empress Theodora. And then in gratitude to the Empress, St. Lazarus painted an icon of St. John the Baptist, and he repainted the famous icon of Christ over the main gate of the imperial palace, which was destroyed by Emperor Leo III, which set off the first wave of iconoclasm. There is a tradition that one of St. Lazarus' frescoes worked a miracle. A woman scraped paint from the image on the wall, and she put the scraps in water and drank it and was miraculously healed. Apparently, there was a lot of that type of thing that went on during the time, reflecting the fervor of people towards these holy images and the grace of God that they believed was present and could afford them miraculous healings. Another saint was Saint Methodius. He was a monk. He was the patriarch of Constantinople. He is not to be confused with Saint Cyril and Methodius. This is a different Saint Methodius. He was a monk, he was a priest, and he was an advocate in favor of holy icons. He was highly educated, and yet another emperor named Michael the Stammerer, so they call him, had him locked up in prison because this emperor believed he was defeated in war because God was punishing him for letting this so-called icon worshiper, Saint Methodius, get too close to him. And Saint Methodius said to Emperor Michael, "No, the Lord is angry with you for insulting his holy icons." So the emperor had Methodius tortured. He was struck in the face, his jaw was broken, he was sent off to an island, and he was locked up in a sepulcher with 2 robbers. This sepulcher was dark and damp, they had little food, and he languished in this dark and damp sepulcher for 7 years. And during his imprisonment in this tomb, which can't be really described as much of anything else, one of the robbers died that he was locked up with, and he was not permitted to open the tomb to remove the body and bury it. And so he and the other prisoner had to endure the stench of the decaying body. He was eventually released, and the other prisoner was left behind. When he was released, Methodius looked like a skeleton, but his spirit was not broken. And then the Empress Theodora appointed Methodius as the Patriarch of Constantinople. And during his time as Patriarch, she convened the Council of Constantinople in 843. And at this council, the Holy Fathers assembled with all the confessors, the priests, and the monks who came from the far corners of the earth, bearing on their bodies the bloody wounds of their confession of the true faith. The council anathematized or denounced heretics and confirmed the decrees of the earlier council, the Seventh Ecumenical Council. And Patriarch Methodius wrote a Synodicon, which is an official definition promulgated by a synod. That's why it's called Synodicon. And in this Synodicon, in this proclamation, it declared anathema, or denounced, all those who opposed the teaching of the church with regard to icons. Those anathemas are still read today in some of the Byzantine churches on the Sunday of Orthodoxy. If you want to see it on YouTube, I know the Melkite Church does this service of pronouncing these anathemas, and it's very moving. It's very interesting to watch. But the Synodicon declared anathema to the calumniators of the Christians, that is, to the image breakers. Anathema to those who apply the words of Holy Scripture which were spoken against idols to the venerable images. Anathema to those who do not salute the holy and venerable images, and anathema to those who call the sacred images idols. And then Methodius led a triumphal procession with icons through the city at the end of the council into the Church of Hagia Sophia on March 11th, 843, the first Sunday of Lent, which inaugurated the official restoration of the veneration of holy icons. Since that time, every year on the first Sunday of Lent, the Byzantine churches, both Orthodox and Catholic, continue this tradition by having a procession of icons around the church. It's known as the Sunday of the Triumph of Orthodoxy, or the Triumph of Right Belief. Iconography around the Houston area. So there's this brewery called St. Arnold Brewery in downtown Houston. And in the brewery, there is an icon of St. Arnold painted on the wall. This is a copy of it. This icon was painted by a Russian Orthodox priest and his son, who were iconographers. Now you can see in the icon that they followed the canons of iconography, right? But it was painted on a wall in a brewery, and so it's not really meant to be venerated, okay? If we were to go in there and see this icon on the wall, for example, we wouldn't bow before it, we wouldn't kiss it, we wouldn't pray before it, because it's in a place where it's not meant to be venerated. And probably 99.99% of the people who sit in front of it eating their nachos, drinking their beer, have no concept that this is anything other than an unusual or interesting work of art. Okay? Now, it's a very impressive icon, and you can see it's followed the canons and the rules, but it's put in a place. We don't know exactly the intention of the iconographer, why he agreed to do this and put it in a brewery. I will say this, however, that, St. Arnold is the patron saint of brewers, and brewing beer is something that a lot of monasteries do, and it was started for its health reasons, not to party. And so a lot of monasteries that brew beer, for example, they may put an icon or an image of the saint over maybe the entrance to that part of the monastery, invoking the intercession or the patronage of the saint to bless them in their work, which is a worthy and noble thing. This is in a brewery that is just a public place. We don't know what the intention was of the people who started the brewery, or how it came to be called St. Arnold. We don't know. And so this would be an interesting or unusual work of art, but not so much something that would be venerated. I wouldn't go in there and kiss the icon, because it's just, although if this icon were somewhere else, I would, but there, not so much. I've also heard of a coffee shop that has icons on the walls, okay? Again, icons are meant to be venerated. Probably the owner of the coffee shop thought that this is interesting and unusual and put them on the wall, and again, it wouldn't be something you would venerate, even if you knew about icons and you knew about the veneration of icons. Along those lines, we also see many times in restaurants, if you go into a Mexican restaurant, many times you'll see an image or a statue of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is a sincerely held belief of the owners, and they're putting it there because they maybe put the restaurant under her patronage, or they have a sincerely held devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe. In Greek restaurants, you'll often see an icon of St. George. I've been to a coffee shop that has a little mosaic of St. Joseph behind the register, and it's because the owners had a particular devotion to St. Joseph, another sincerely held belief. Whether or not this was painted because of a sincerely held belief at the brewery, I don't know, but nevertheless, there it is. If you're interested in Russian history, the Serbian Orthodox Church in Galveston, the Church of Saints Constantine and Helen, which was formed in 1895, was personally supported by Tsar Nicholas of Russia, who said, "Let there be an Orthodox Church in Galveston." But he donated the icons and the gospel book, which are still at the parish today. The church is also the resting place of the Tsar's childhood tutor, who is buried beneath the altar and considered by some in the Orthodox Church to be a saint. And then finally, around the Houston area, there are icon workshops. The painting and veneration of icons has really experienced a renewal in the Latin Church and even amongst non-Catholic Christians. Due to the proliferation of information on the internet, the painting and study of iconography is becoming more widespread, with icon workshops now being offered all over the world. So here's my closing thoughts. The iconoclastic controversy was not simply a clash of wills in which one side wanted to venerate icons and the other did not. It was ultimately a Christological heresy that went at the very heart of the incarnation of Jesus Christ. It was defeated through the writings of St. John of Damascus and St. Theodore the Studite, the declarations of the councils, which profess the theology of the incarnation of Christ as the basis for its defense. And the cause was carried out by monastics, theologians, emperors, patriarchs, and the faithful who suffered persecution, torture, exile, and even death. The veneration of icons affirms the goodness of the material world that God created, and it affirms that the physical world has the potential for being transfigured and resurrected, that it participates in the restoration of humanity to the divine image and likeness of God, which was lost by Adam's fall. Through the incarnation, Christ makes all things new. And as we recover the divine image and likeness through spiritual transformation, we become partakers of the divine nature. And we reflect the truth of St. John of Damascus' words. The whole earth is a living icon of the face of God. Glory to Jesus Christ. Glory forever.